You know, I've been doing a lot of Hot Fuzz cartoons lately. I should check and see how long it's been since I've done a video on something RPG related. Sweet fudge in a tin! In mid-2021, I got to play Edge of the Empire as a player with a friend jamming. This was my first introduction to Foundry VTT. I'd been running an Edge game just on Discord with RPG sessions, and was pleased with how well the system worked with just theater of the mind. But I was impressed with many of the conveniences of Foundry: dice rolling, auto-computation, note-taking, map interaction, and so forth. I started taking a look at it, but couldn't decide if I wanted to take the leap, plunk down $50 that could go to another core book, and figure out all the technical maze work of secure hosting. But a sale over the holidays brought me around and convinced me to give it a shot. The B game migrated over at session 13 in spring 2022, Core to the Force started out directly in Foundry. I've also run 2 one-shots and 4 sessions of a short-form arc called Boosties Millions. But after all that, what do I have to say about it? What's it like to run 75 sessions of Star Wars on Foundry VTT? Let me start by saying this isn't meant to be a comprehensive video on how to use Foundry VTT. This is more about the benefits and rough patches you'll experience if you decided to go this route with your gaming group. The software is $50, though it does occasionally go on sale around the holidays. Only one person in the gaming group has to have a copy of the software though. The GM's computer acts as server host on a networked Windows, Mac, or Linux computer. Players access the GM software from ordinary web browsers like Chrome, Firefox, Opera, or Edge. But not Safari, the deserted island of web browsers. Edge is also kind of meh. But if you have a steady group who want to pitch in for Foundry, that's a great way to get started with the software. But speaking of steady group, I will say that Foundry is not for every GM. Foundry VTT is a good system for the committed GM. If you've got 20 or so sessions of a campaign under your belt, solid prep, informative notes, that is the sort of GM who will get the most out of Foundry. If you find yourself struggling to reach 10 sessions, you might be better served using your money for a new game module that can keep your campaign going. But if Foundry doesn't make GMing easier, then why bother? The main benefit of Foundry VTT is that it pays additional gameplay dividends on game prep you may already do, or new prep that you're willing to add. For example, you put together a set of stats for your NPCs. That's pretty typical. Prep these stats in Foundry and you've got easy access for rolling those NPCs' skill dice or using their talents or weapons. If you're a rollable table person, both you and your players can roll and consult the results of tables quickly. And if you're a map GM, Foundry offers options to manage visibility, doors, lighting, and other properties, but we'll go into more details on maps in a bit. And if you're willing to hunt down music and audio effects, Foundry can play those on cue for you to add to your atmosphere. So let's fire up Foundry VTT and see what the experience is like for a GM and a player. To demonstrate, I've got Foundry version 10 operating locally on my computer, and I've opened 2 private browsing windows in order to function as my 2 players, since each one will need a separate login. And this brings us to one of the important speed bumps that can pop up in a Foundry session, which is ownership. Anything in Foundry that is usable by a player, such as character, items, and tables, can be set for one of 4 ownership levels: None, Limited, Observer, and Owner. So let's take a look at Player 1 here, and Player 1 doesn't have access to much of anything in the Actors area, and this is because we haven't set our ownership levels. So, let's set Player 1 as the owner of Character 1, and we'll set them as the Observer of Character 2, and we'll set them as Limited for NPC 1 here. And we'll set them as Limited. And we won't set anything for NPC 4. So now we switch over to Player 1's screen here. And as we can see, we have access to Player 1's screen. And we can change things. So let's try and give them Agility 4. Works just fine. We'll move that back to Agility 3. Now we can also look at Player 2's screen, but we can't change anything. We can highlight things, copy and paste, and things like that. But we can't increase or decrease anything. And when we look at NPC 1, we can just get very vague details, just what the GM chooses to allow us to access. So there's not much to see here. And as you can see, Player 1 cannot see NPC 2 at all. It is completely invisible to player 1. And ownership is a major speed bump in Foundry, and this is because it's fine to have set up custom tables or items for players, but it doesn't do any good if you have to bring gameplay and immersion to a halt because your players can't find the entry for the cool new weapon they just picked up. So be prepared to set and manage ownership as you introduce Foundry assets to players. Now that the players have their stats, they can start rolling dice. For this, you'll want the Star Wars FFG mod by Ezra and Cia Stadler, which I hope I pronounced correctly, which I'll talk about in more detail later in the video. As the GM, I can make a call for a roll. Player 1, roll athletics with a difficulty of 2. So let's go over to our player 1 screen, bring up their stats. Player 1, we click on their athletics skill, and by default, it is set for 2, which is pretty typical. We hit roll, go back to our chat window, and we can see the results, allowing us to account for the outcome. So player 1 has achieved their athletics check to jump across a small chasm, but has picked up a bit of threat, so maybe lost a boot or something in the leap. Nothing too significant, but very inconvenient, or perhaps gained a strain. But we don't just roll normal difficulty all the time, so player 2, roll me computers with 2 challenge, 1 difficulty, 1 setback, 1 boost, and then upgrade your skill pool. A little more complicated, but still very streamlined. Player 2 clicks on the dice pool next to their computer skill, which is very rudimentary. Now you left click on the number next to the dice to increase how many are rolled, so we need 2 challenge, a boost, a setback, and you also right click to reduce the number of dice rolled, so we can right click on difficulty to reduce that to 1, and then click on the upgrade to adjust the skill pool, upgrade ability, and hit roll. Go back over to the chat window, and we can see that player 2 didn't do so well, but didn't incur any new additional penalties. The pool is easy to manage, and the road addition is done for us, which helps speed up the dice pool interpretation. Items can be created in their appropriate section. Simply create a new entry, select the type, fill out the stats accordingly. Once ownership levels are set, players can drag and drop these onto their character sheets. Journals are available for both the GM and players, assuming you have ownership set properly. Journals can contain images, PDFs, and even player editable text, depending on the information you want to distribute. There's even a button at the top of each journal that allows you to show the content to some or all players. So if you have something you want to present to one or more players, this gives you an avenue to do it. Tables are also available, as I mentioned earlier, and if you've played FFG's system long enough, you know that you are going to need access to the critical hit table on a regular basis, especially if your players like frequent combat. So make sure you have one prepped, even if you have to take the time to make it yourself. But now, for Foundry VTT's biggest showpiece and best contribution to GMing, and also a source of one of its biggest hiccups, scenes and maps. Now, Foundry doesn't help you draw maps, but it will give you the means to leverage your maps to add atmosphere and mystique to your game. Firstly, you have access to walls and doors, and here we have a map with different walls drawn, and we can switch to player 1 to see what kind of influence this has on gameplay. So here we are with player 1. You have basic walls, which is over here in this structure, which block everything. And then up here you have terrain walls, which block movement, but allow the player to see through one layer of wall, and this allows you to make maps where players can see into a forest but not through it, or see partly into the walls of a cave where you can show off little touches of character. See, I've added this skeleton here, but if you step outside to where you have to look through 2 layers, it's not as visible anymore. There are invisible walls which block movement, but not vision. We colloquially refer to these as windows. Now ethereal walls, which we have down here, block vision, but not movement. And this is a great way to simulate those fog gates that you see in the Dark Souls games. Now doors block vision and movement when closed because they are doors, and can be locked or unlocked by the GM by right-clicking the door symbol. So here the player can unlock this door and peek inside. However, the player clicks on this door and a lock sound activates. Now secret doors, we'll go back to the GM screen. Secret doors hide their interaction button from the players and can only be toggled by the GM. So as the GM, I can open up that door for player 1, and we switch over to player 1's view, and as you can see, they can now go through that wall because there's actually secretly a door there. Now, in addition to walls, you also have access to visibility and fog. Visibility limits the player view distance, as you would expect. And we toggle that from the GM screen. By right-clicking on a player and clicking here, you can choose their bright and dim distance. And in addition to that, this also lets you sample what the view will look like for that player. When you click on them, you see what the player is going to see. You click off of them, you see the entire map, so you can continue editing. And also, fog trails. Fog leaves trails where players have tread, allowing them to retain knowledge of the map, but not what may be following them. So, player 1 has looked into this area up here, but it's kind of gone dim again, so perhaps something moved in there that might encounter the player later. But with maps comes one of the road bumps of Foundry, because sometimes you'll activate a new scene and the first thing you hear is, GM, I can't see anything. In fact, let's go over to the player 2's view. And as you can see, it's completely dark. This is because you have to have the proper visibility attributes set in both the scene setting and the player token setting. Mess up one or the other and players may not see anything, or you may end up showing them more than you intended. And it can take a moment to fix this on the fly, longer than it takes to fix ownership levels. So always, before switching players over to a new scene, make sure you have your token attributes and your scene attributes ready to go. Two other pitfalls you should keep in mind when running Foundry. First is one part that tends to happen when you incorporate sounds. So let's go over to player 1 screen and go over to the sound setting with the global sound volumes. Audio is set to maximum volume by default and is controlled by the player's client, not the GM server. So be sure to run a sound test level with your players at the start of the campaign so they can tune their client's volume settings to a comfortable level. Another one is campaign size. As you add maps, tokens, items, notes, sounds, and other files, this can greatly expand the workload on your network. It can reach a point where Foundry becomes almost unusable. Between sessions, always review your content and move any material you'd like to archive to a compendium. Assets in the compendium aren't distributed with the rest of your Foundry content. Keeping your campaign will speed up load times for your players when logging in or switching from scene to scene. Also, consider clearing the Foundry chat log from time to time. Narrative dice rolls are more complex than simple D20 rolls, and the data does add up after a while. And speaking of narrative dice, let's talk about some important mods. First is Star Wars FFG by Ezrin and Sia Stadler. I hope I pronounced that right. If you're running Foundry version 10, the most current as of this video, you'll want the Star Wars FFG mod version 1.801 or later. Like most mods, this one is fan-made. As new versions of Foundry come out, there can be some compatibility quirks. Be patient. Remember, these users are passionate fans who are making the system functional for everyone else. Also remember that Foundry is designed around D20 systems and not every change is easy to implement. For example, D20 systems tend to use a strict numerical initiative order, and Foundry's default initiative systems is designed so that only the active player can move around on their turn. Our system uses initiative slots, with players negotiating and strategizing the order in which they place themselves, which is harder to implement in Foundry. Initiative is still something I work out on paper, and this doesn't hamper the flow of combat. The next mandatory mod is Dice So Nice by Simone. We narrative dice users are not a bunch of D20 hucking peasants, content to let a single die rattle around to determine our fate. No, we gorge ourselves with a trough of vibrant color and trademark symbols, vomiting up handfuls of clattering plastic to scry our fates. With Dice So Nice, instead of your dice rolls looking like this, your dice rolls now look like this. Like a proper tabletop. And Dice So Nice supports a range of narrative systems, including Genesis and Legend of the Five Ring symbols as well. Two other mods I'll recommend. Hourglass by Octarine. It creates a classy hourglass to act as a timer, adding the tension of a countdown to your game. You can even set it to alarm with different sounds, with my favorite being the gong. Also, FX Master by Ghost. FX Master adds a range of particle systems to Foundry, elevating your options for atmosphere in your maps. Carbonite Fog, rain, and various effects for common D20 spells. You can even use slow-moving dots to suggest the passage of stars around your spaceship map. The last thing I will discuss is hosting. You can run Foundry VTT on your home computer, however there are going to be some security hurdles to jump over. You'll need the proper ports open on your firewall and a VPN or proxy service of some kind so that your players can simulate being on your local network. This has been a source of concern for me since I have some folders on my computer shareable on my local network so that I can pass files between my animation computer and my render farm. And on occasion a mystery computer would show up on my network. And I'm not a network security expert, I'd rather cultivate skill as a GM or animator, so I choose to use the Forge hosting service. Forge offers security and storage and provides a way to easily add and remove mods from your games. Yes, I do pay a small fee each month, but Forge is structured around running Foundry VTT, and the campaign management has made the price worthwhile. And this is not an ad, this is a sincere recommendation. Other security options do exist, but that's unfortunately not my area of expertise. But there are users on the Foundry subreddit and Discord servers who can help you out with other setup options. That's all I've got for this video. I'll get back to Nick and his friends on Sanford 6 soon. Thanks for watching, consider hitting all the usual YouTube buttons, and happy gaming.